I'm going to go ahead and call us to order and declare that we have a quorum of 7 members present. Item C1, consideration, discussion, possible action related to the 2019-20 budget development. Dr. Ely.
Mr. President, members of the board, we are continuing to work through the budget development process for the 2019-2020 school year. Just a reminder that the budget must be adopted and tax rates set before September the 1st when we start our new fiscal year. So we've got a few more months to be able to work on this. A lot of what you'll be seeing tonight, well, what you will be seeing tonight, all of it is reflected on current law. As you know, we're in the middle of a legislative session, or actually we're at the very end of a legislative session. It ends on Monday, Memorial Day, and so at this point right now we do not have new school finance legislation. House Bill 3 is continuing to be worked through the committee process. One version has passed the House, one version has passed the Senate. A conference committee made up of 5 senators and 5 representatives are working through negotiations on a compromise that could go through the House and Senate and be passed. At this point right now, we don't know where we're going to be on that. So what you'll see this evening reflects current law. We are still hopeful, cautiously optimistic, probably more on the cautiously than the optimistic today. That something will be able to happen before the end of this regular session next Monday. And if that does come to fruition, then we will be rapidly learning how that will affect College Station ISD and making new projections based on new information, should we have it at the time. That being said, Mr. Mike Martindale, Deputy Superintendent, Chief Financial Officer, is here to give you the May update of where we are in the budget development process. Mr. Martindale.
Thank you, Dr. Ely. Board members, of course, what we have, as Dr. Ely mentioned, everything I'll show you this evening relative to the 19-20 budgets under current law. So there's a possibility that a week from today, everything I'm showing you tonight is meaningless. So we'll see. Maybe we hope for that, I guess, to a degree. So anyway, before we move to 19-20 projections, let me just update you real quickly where we're trending on our current year budget. The ADA, and that was through our fifth 6 weeks. So that number of 12,742, it will change also the end of this week as we wrap up the school year. We'll run a final number for that. I think it'll hold fairly steady. Our enrollment actually to date is higher this year than last year. So I'm hoping that number holds steady. Maybe if we're fortunate, maybe it'll crawl closer back up towards 0 a little bit, but it's been holding fairly steady the last 2 6 weeks. So 0.18% negative from previous year. I did amend our property tax revenue to $104,884,000 coming into this month, and these changes are reflected in budget amendments and the financials posted for this month. It was previously $104,634,000, so we made an adjustment up of $250,000 on our property tax collections. Our collections rate are trending well, so we went ahead and made that adjustment and recognized that revenue. Our interest income made an adjustment there as well. Last month I had $1.2 million. We're already at that point, and we're trending toward $1.5 million on our interest income. The rates are holding well. Our pool is at 2.4, right around the 2.4% mark, and of course, with our banking institution, we get even higher than that on our overnight funds. So we amended those values to recognize more revenue. Also, our SHARs, our reimbursement, that was 1.9 last month. I adjusted that up to $2 million, just $100,000. I have an asterisk on that, and I've mentioned this to you. I may have touched on it just briefly last month, but I know I put it in the transmittal as well. They're changing the settle up dates on that, so we're actually going to recognize 2 settle up payments in 1 year. So I would anticipate we're supposed to receive an additional SHAR settle up payment sometime in June. So you could very well, when we visit next month, see that $2 million trending above the $3 million mark. So I anticipate we'll add an additional $1 million revenue on SHARs.
Will that
carry over next year?
Yeah.
No, sir.
We won't double up again.
But
No, sir.
We will get one next year.
Correct.
Okay, so
Correct. We'll reset the budget back to the $2 million mark for next year. They've adjusted those payments and changed the timing of them. So as they're adopting the new payment schedule, it pushes 2 payments at once. We were notified like February and March. It, of course, it'd been nice to know that ahead of time, so we could have budgeted accordingly. But anyway, we'll recognize an additional funds there as well next month. So we're trending in a positive direction as far as our revenue projections. Something else, and I'll touch on in a little more detail here briefly, is we did approve some of our exceptional item requests that our folks submitted for 1920. We can capture that in current year budget. That was $134,000 that we approved here just a few weeks ago and notified some of those folks. And also, we're tracking now on our deficit of $3.2 million. Last month we were at 3.8, and if I remind you, we adopted a 4.6. So obviously, if you think 3.2, I just mentioned an additional $1 million of revenue to you a little while ago. So we're going to do very well relative to what we actually adopted. So start looking at next year, just going to touch on some historical value for you. I did get our preliminary values from the appraisal district. Those value growths are slowing down. They're really kind of resetting. We had some really great years, as you're all aware, and you can see here they're starting to settle back into, I think, what will be more of a steady growth. I'm anticipating us year-over-year property tax revenue to be in the 5%, 5.85% once they kind of settle up any reviews and we get the final values. Right now, on the preliminary values that the appraisal district provided me, I'm using 2.5% loss on those values. That's what we've averaged the last 5 or 6 years off preliminary values, and a collection rate of 99.5%. So we're tracking, and this is the value I use as we project over the next few months until we get the final values. Average daily attendance, as I mentioned, the negative 0.18 for current year. That will move on us just a little bit as we finish this year. The 2.93%, as you're aware, I've mentioned several times, this is from our demographer as we project out for next year. So that's the value we'll use also to make our projections for next year. Quickly touch on this, and then we'll move into 1920, just some historical value. You can see our adopted budgets, the second column from the left, where we came in on audit. If we were paying Chapter 41 recapture payments that year, we've been Chapter 41, we weren't necessarily paying recapture payments. But you can see the historicals there, moving into 17, 18, where we began paying again. Again, we're trending around the $14 million mark this year. Timelines, again, we're an update at this board meeting. June, an additional update. A lot will depend on what is happening or what happened with school funding. There's a possibility we can be coming forward with some compensation plans and recommendations for next year as well. An additional update in July, get final values July the 25th. Of course, as Dr. Ely mentioned earlier, in August, at the August 20th board meeting is when we'll bring a final proposed budget and the tax rate that supports that. So we're looking into 1920. New personnel requests from throughout the district was $4.2 million. Exceptional item request was $2.2 million. On the exceptional item request, the $2.2 million, $1.5 million of that are kind of they're associated with requests to increase budgets, operational budgets next year, or they're tied for equipment and those types of things associated with new personnel that were requested. So I kind of pulled that out. So just things that consider one-time purchases, so to speak, that we might can look at really is around the $700,000 mark as opposed to the full 2.2. An example is adding additional grounds crew. Well, those are positions, but with those positions, we need vehicle and mowers and those types of things. So that equipment is embedded in those exceptional item requests. So it would be tied to any new personnel we consider for next year, if that makes sense. So we did, as I mentioned earlier, we approved 134,000. We're capturing that in this year's general fund. Some of those items, we did some furniture and science equipment that Ms. Elder had requested over at Consol. Also, our high school band directors got together and requested some things for each of the bands. Both of their requests were very similar, so we were able to capture both of those for each of our high school bands. And then there were a couple other smaller items that Blair requested from Pebble Creek and also from our Kate department at College Station High School. New personnel request, as I mentioned, was $4.2 million. Right now, with our circumstances, we'd set aside $500,000 to add new positions for next year. I've accounted for that at this point in time. We had $350,000 worth of special education teachers that we picked up October, November last year because of growth. We had the federal funds to handle those. We're transitioning to next year. We're not going to have the federal funds available, so to hang on to those folks, we're going to have to transfer those costs to our general fund. And that is a payroll cost of about $350,000. You can see where those teachers are located: Consolidated, Creekview, South Knoll, and Pebble Creek, and an additional speech pathologist for the district. The remaining $150,000 is for special ed, special education, an additional teacher at Greens Prairie, and also for a couple of special ed teachers at River Bend. And I had not captured those in the $850,000 I've been using for River Bend. Historically, we've been able to reallocate and meet those needs, but because of the growth, it's going to be new cost. Current law, using 2.39% on our growth for enrollment or attendance, 2.93%. You can see our historical average. Those historicals are 7 or 8 year average in those particular categories. The local values, as I mentioned earlier, I'm anticipating our revenue over this year on property values to be in about the 5.5% to 6% range once we get through down to final values. Our appropriations indicators remain constant from before. I have $1.4 million for salary adjustments, which is equal to 1.5% raise off midpoint, and $750 for teachers. Nothing for increased health insurance premiums or adds to supplies budgets. The additional positions I've mentioned to you previously. River Bend, outside of those couple of special ed positions, is right at $850,000, and recapture continues to track at right at $18 million. So none of those indicators really on the appropriations side have changed. But we did make a little bit of progress, a little bit. A 5 looks better than a 6. I'll put it like that. Start up top on the revenue side. Again, the 2.93% increase, the 5.85 on property tax. I anticipate our property tax revenue to end right at to land right about the $111 million mark. Now, that's under current system. A lot of talk with the new legislation is there's compression and those types of things. So that number could very well look extremely different to us by next month. $2 million, that's the SHARS. Mr. Harris, you were asking to reset that value. It was 1.9, increased it to $2 million. Where there was a little bit of difference, the 1st of May, TEA did their initial runs of their financial runs for next year. It's current law, but they adjust some of the funding elements. So we recognized about $1.3 million on that side. So between recognizing that additional revenue, and I actually pulled our projected property tax revenue down a little bit, is where we're recognizing that difference. Last month, we were tracking at a $6.6 million deficit, so we're right at 5.9 now. But those are the revenue changes up top. On the appropriations side, again, River Bend, the new positions that I mentioned, special ed, recapture, tracking at $18 million, And then, as I mentioned, 5.9 million as opposed to 6.6. So we're making a little bit of progress, primarily due to the funding formulas, the TEA updating going into the new biennium. And those will hold, if nothing happens, those adjustments to the funding formulas will remain in place. This is our projection out. Current year 1920 that I just showed you. What I did, because the property values are starting to settle in, they haven't been as high as years past. I was using a 6% growth on these numbers, so I pulled those down to 5.5% in the out years. Kept the ADA percentages; those are all based from our demographics. Those numbers haven't changed, so you can see how we're tracking in the out years. And I don't have the values here, but I'll show you the graph. It'll show you these numbers relative to what you saw last month as far as the cash value number. Remember, the gold or yellow is 17.5% of the projected appropriations for that year. The red is where we were tracking when we adopted our budget last August. Green was last month. So you can see where our green's moving. And purple is this month. So we moved up a little bit because we are projecting our deficit to be less, so we have a larger fund balance. We improved next year's numbers because of change in our funding formulas. So that gave us some movement, tracked us a little bit better than last month. So still some work to do, but made a little bit of progress from previous month. And again, this time next week, we'll see. So Dr. Ely and I had some wonderful visits at the Capitol last Friday. So I'm optimistic.
Good.
We have to answer any questions. Yes.
Well, he didn't sell me. Questions, comments? Yeah, next month will be.
Was there any discussion if they don't come to a resolution this week, if they'll be called in a special session?
No one right now is talking about a special session like they were about a month ago.
Okay.
They'll get the budget done, it looks like, House Bill 1, which is the state budget. Honestly, I think that there is a political will to get something done. I think the bills are close enough that the differences have been identified, and there's a lot of negotiating back and forth, having the House go back in caucus and the Senate go back in caucus and saying, here's kind of where we are. How does it work for folks? And quite frankly, the legislators are receiving runs from the Legislative Budget Board to see how the school districts in their legislative district are being impacted. And so I know those 181 legislators are going to vote their district. And so to the extent that that the school finance is equitable and positively impacts school districts of all different shapes and sizes, I think we will get something done. There are still some different aspects that the House is holding on to and the ideologies that the Senate's holding on to as well that we'll see what lasts there. I think both of them have some things that they can give on and some that they hold pretty sacrosanct.
Gotcha.
The problem is for us is we don't know what's going on behind closed doors, and we're just kind of waiting to see like everybody else is.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Any more? Okay, thank you very much. Takes us to item C2, consideration and discussion related to board policy FFAC local regarding EpiPens. Dr. Ely.
Thank you, Mr. Harris, members of the board. When you come to a board meeting, you never know what you're going to be talking about. And so this month, we're going to talk about EpiPens. Obviously, epinephrine pens have been a great advance in medical science for kids and individuals who have anaphylaxis and get in very short order and a very tenuous medical situation. We have EpiPens in our school district. We have board policy that governs those EpiPens. Right now, the way our board policy is written, each person who has an EpiPen must be trained, and we have to assign those EpiPens to particular individuals. What we are going to begin a discussion with you this evening is amending that policy perhaps in the future to allow us to have more EpiPens available for other people to be able to use in an emergency situation and available at different times of the day and available when these people who have been trained under our current rules are not available. So I've got Molly Perry, our Chief Administrative Officer here, who works in the policy realm, and she's will do a much better job than me of explaining what we really want to talk about in regards to EpiPens. Mrs. Perry.
Thank you, Dr. Ewan. Good evening. So as you all are probably well aware, we are seeing significant increases in allergies among not only our students, but folks that are in our schools for a variety of reasons. And we do currently have unassigned EpiPens in our nurse's office in the event that there's an emergency situation and we need to administer epinephrine quickly for someone who doesn't necessarily have that with them. But there were some policy changes that went into effect actually back in August, and so we are at a point where we're needing to have a conversation to determine which direction we would like to go with this. Because if we would like to continue having those unassigned EpiPens available, then we would need to expand their availability to any time the school is open for events. And so in order to do that, we would need to have them available around areas like gyms and auditoriums and other locations where we might have folks after regular school hours. We'd also need to make sure that we have provided training for all of our staff, because these would be located in places where they could be quickly available in an emergency and people would know where they are. And so we do propose in beginning that conversation tonight about updating the policy to ensure that we can have those unassigned EpiPens available to anyone that needs them, and that they don't necessarily have to be assigned out to a particular person. So we would actually begin this training before school starts at all of our campuses to ensure that we're prepared.
Okay, now, we're just starting the discussion tonight?
Just starting the discussion.
Okay, so we're not taking action tonight.
No, we're not.
Any
We,
thought?
we don't have policy language in front of you. We can bring that back next time to kind of show you what we're talking about. But we just want to talk about the concept here first with everyone, and love to answer any questions.
Well, speaking just for me, I generally am in favor of it. It sounds like a great idea to have expanded access in case there's a need when a lot of people are there, but I'm certainly no expert on allergies and EpiPen, so.
Has
Other
there been a
thoughts?
situation that occurred that we needed to be able to have access to an EpiPen that's caused this?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, we use them regularly from time to
Sure.
time. If you think about the peanut allergies and different things that we
Sure.
have. So we have occasions to use them. Right now, well, previous to the board policy changing earlier this year, we could have them unassigned. Now, we would have to amend that language
Got it.
to be able to have them unassigned in those particular locations. So instead of just the athletic trainer having them, or one teacher in first grade, and certainly the school nurse, can we have them strategically located and make those available?
We would be looking for action most likely in June, so that we could also include a notice to our families included in the student handbooks for the 1920 school year.
What's the potential downside of this? Or is there a potential downside of this? I mean, it seems to me a pretty straightforward.
From a safety point of view, I think there's little downside. If someone could, you could get an EpiPen and go stick your friend with the EpiPen and watch them have a not great next hour and a half. It would not kill them, but yeah. So that is what happens when you have unassigned EpiPens.
It's not like we're just going to hang them on a wall and say, anybody, here's your EpiPen. I mean, they're still going to be in locations that probably only teachers are really going to know about, right?
Right.
Right. We would not advertise the location. However, anyone that's involved with the training would obviously be aware.
Right. But then they will have been trained. So
Yes. And so everybody on the campus will have been trained in and how to use them. In fact, we're training our staff here centrally on Friday when we have our central office faculty meeting. Everybody's going to stick the superintendent, so I'm just kidding. Thank you, Mr. Schaefer.
Can we come? No. How about cost? Is it a material consideration?
There was a lot of discussion about cost of EpiPens. You may have recalled in the news, I want to say back in August or so, because the prices were increasing dramatically, but since then they've really come down. We don't anticipate that this would be any substantial cost. We would, of course, need to maintain a log of the dates of expiration and update them accordingly, but that would be something that we managed on our end.
Okay. Okay.
And you just let us know if there's any more information you'd like for us to bring next month when we discuss it again. We'll certainly have policy language for you to look at that time.
Sounds good.
Yep.
Anyone else? No. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Item C3, consideration discussion related to board policy DEC local regarding hardship leave for full-time employees. Dr. Ely.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Trustees, again, in your role as a policy-making body, we want to look at some of our existing board policy in regards to leave for employees, especially employees who are have a medical situation or a disability or are caring for family members with certain types of disabilities, and for a gap, I guess, in some of that coverage for some of our different employees. So we're going to take a little bit of time, and we actually have a presentation right here to talk about the different types of leave that exist and kind of get to the heart towards the end of what we'd like to start a discussion on and what we're considering as an administration. So with that, to kind of walk us through some of the board policy that we have in regards to employee leave is Mrs. Perry.
All right, thank you. So I know it's a little unusual to have a presentation when we begin policy discussion, but when we start looking at all of the different policies surrounding leave, the types of leave, the types of paid leave, it becomes quite complex. And so we thought it would be good to provide a little more comprehensive background this time. So really, when we get to the heart of tonight's discussion, we're talking about extended leaves, when either their employee or their family members require an absence of more than 5 consecutive days. And in those circumstances, we do require medical certification, and that goes through our Human Resources Department to really determine, is this someone who under policy is eligible for leave? Of course, if they have accumulated any paid leave, that would be exhausted concurrently so that we could continue to compensate that employee as long as they do have that available. So just as a disclaimer too, as we move forward, this is not going to encompass every possible type of leave because there are other components, but we're really going to focus in on where we might have some gaps in that coverage. So primarily, when we think about the types of leave that employees accumulate for paid purposes, we've got our state personal leave, and that's under Texas statute. School districts must provide 5 of those, what we call state days, per school year. Those can accumulate indefinitely, and if you were to leave and go to another school district, those actually travel with you. Once your service record is processed by that district, they add that into your bank, and it can be used for any type of reason. You don't even have to disclose what that is, but it does require advanced approval. So our local leave is specified under DEC local, and that is really most commonly referred to as sick leave. If I need to be out for my child or myself to illness or injury, then I would use local leave typically. And the number of days that I receive annually depends on the length of my contract. So if I'm a 10-month employee, as our teachers are, then I would have 5 days. If I am a year-round employee, I would have up to 7. There is not a limit on accumulation here, but you can't take those days with you. If you were to leave and have a balance there, that would just dissipate. So those days do get prorated if we have folks that start later than the beginning of a contract. They would not receive all of those days. We do have other types of leave that I'm not going to go into in detail this evening, like comp time and vacation. So temporary disability is one way that someone might take an extended leave. This leave under state policy is only available for those positions that require educator certification. So, of course, all of our teachers, our principals, Dr. Ely, anyone whose job description requires that could potentially be eligible for temporary leave if they have a condition certified by a physician that interferes with their performance and requires them to be out. Again, we would use any leave that they have for compensation until it's exhausted, and then that could go up to 180 calendar days. More commonly known, we have the family medical leave component, which is federal law, and this is defined under our DECA legal. So when we think about family medical leave, we often think about, oh, you know, you've got your 12 weeks annual available, that protects your position, and then that's very true, but there are some other caveats for eligibility. One of those is that that person has to have been employed with the district for at least 12 months. Doesn't necessarily have to be consecutively, but it has to be 12. And they have to have worked 1,250 hours. So you might have somebody that's been here 12 months, but perhaps is not a full-time, all the way 37.5-hour-a-week employee. And then the third is a component related to the size of the district in terms of the number of employees. So we, of course, qualify in that particular area. There are also very specific reasons under family medical leave for employees to be able to take this type of leave. It's very specific to the birth of a child and to care for that newborn child of your own, or if you as an employee have a child in foster or adoption that's been placed in the care of the employee. It could be spouse, son, or daughter, or parent with a serious health condition, so that first degree of consanguinity. You've also got those health conditions for that employee personally. So similar to the temporary disability, you could take family medical leave, but there are not those restrictions about educator certification here. And then the last two are really specific to military circumstances about qualifying exigency, or if you have a family member who is injured in the line of duty. So FML is very specific in terms of when you can take it and who can take it, depending on how long and how much they have worked for the district. So when we look at these types of lengthier leaves, we've seen that there's really some gaps within coverage for some of our employees. And so the first would be if you're an employee who's not yet met that time frame for 12 months or 1,250 hours of service. You would not be eligible for family medical leave. And if you are not an educator under that certification component, you would not be eligible for temporary disability. Now, if you are needing to care for immediate family, under family medical leave, it's very specific. Under our local policy, that definition of immediate family is more expansive, and we'll look at that more specifically in a moment. So those are really the two circumstances where we're seeing, we have some gaps. Occasionally, we have folks that are eligible for leave as an accommodation under the Americans with Disability Act, but this is really more of a broad sort of need for folks that have not been here long enough, or the family member that they need to care for is not an eligible person under FMLA. So with that, we have really been looking at what some other districts are doing, as well as what some potential policy might look like if we were to add hardship leave to our local policy. What we would be looking at here is for, again, full-time employees who are not entitled to those other types of more lengthy leaves. It could be for themselves or an immediate family member, and it would be related to illness, injury, disability of either themselves or their immediate family, or it could potentially be for the birth or placement of a child if they're not eligible under those other caveats. Now, I mentioned that immediate family is a little more expansive. It is defined currently in our local policy, and so this is what that looks like. In addition to the spouse, son, or daughter, it specifies in-laws and stepchildren, legal wards and local parentis, as well as step-siblings, and all siblings for that matter. Siblings are not included in family medical leave, nor are grandparents or grandchildren. And then fifth, and probably the most expensive component might be someone residing in that person's household, because there could be another family member that is very close to that family. So I know that was quite a bit of information for an initial discussion of policy, but we would like to begin that conversation so we can think of ways to perhaps better serve our employees who find themselves in situations of need.
So we'd love to have any conversation, answer any questions. I know it is a lot of information, but this is kind of the heart of it right here is what we're looking at, this gap, these two gaps.
Okay, so let me see if I can summarize it. Basically looking at expanding when leave is available, because it's not currently available because of definition of eligibility or who's covered. And we're talking about expanding that basically in certain areas to make it match up with other areas,
Yes.
Or just expanding it.
or just expanding,
Right.
okay?
So
To
somebody,
cover situations we've seen in the past.
correct. So perhaps somebody has not been employed with the school district for 12 months, but they've been employed for a while. They're a good employee. We would like to be able for them to have this type of leave and have a guarantee of a job. So that's one of them, or haven't worked the 1,250 hours. Or the second part is they have somebody living in their home who they need to take care of that's not covered under very restrictive Family Medical Leave Act. And we'd like to be able to use this already existing, this is what we're considering, using the already existing definition of immediate family in DEC local. And that would cover most of the situations that we have seen here in the district.
Okay, so is it paid leave?
No, it is, if they have, so compensation is thought of differently.
Right.
Let's think of leave right here as their ability to keep their job
Got it.
when they come back. To the extent they have compensation built up, either in the form of vacation or state days or personal days, that is used, and these types of leave just ensure that they have a position waiting for them for a
When they
certain
come
amount of
back?
time.
So
Yes,
they
sir.
don't have to get done with whatever their situation is and then go find another job?
Correct.
So, well, just a quick question. Available when full-time employees who are not entitled to the TDL. And is that just, in this case, someone who has been here less than 12 months? I mean, is there another, because I know the hours is also an issue, but if you're full-time, you're going to hit that number fairly quickly.
So that's family medical leave. Temporary disability is a little different because temporary disability is only available by statute to people whose job requires an educator certification.
Okay.
And so that's the kind of gap on that one, because we have a number of people who work for us who don't require an educator certification.
Okay.
So tell us who those are, so we kind of
The
know.
people who require an educator
No,
certification?
The ones who don't.
Pretty much everybody who's not a teacher, principal, superintendent, diagnostician, counselor. Title I instructional? No, not.
So
not
bus
instructional.
drivers, paras,
Yeah, nurses, no.
librarians.
Librarians, I think, do require a teacher certification to be a librarian, I believe. It's a lot of people who don't.
Okay.
How does like bereavement leave fall into this? So like if a spouse dies of one of our employees or a child, or how does that fall into our policies for leave?
Right, so HR would process that request in a very similar way in terms of looking at eligibility and granting that leave based on the individual circumstances. Because sometimes, folks are out for a few days. Obviously, if it's a spouse or someone very close, you may need a more lengthy period of time, and that would oftentimes move into the realm of medical need.
Oh, it could go into the realm of medical leave.
Could, depending on the circumstances.
And is it, as we're talking about expanding, is it important to call that out in this policy, that could be included?
We could certainly look at that as well. I can talk with our policy consultant. I don't know that we've specified bereavement in other ways, but I'll definitely do some more research in that particular area.
Good question.
Let me ask a not so good question. Well, no, I'm just going to date myself so badly here. When I was teaching a million years ago, I know there was a policy that you could kind of buy your way into with the state. I think you could like donate 5 days of your leave, and you would give that up. But someone else at your school or whatever. You remember what I'm talking about?
Sure. And we have a catastrophic leave bank.
Okay.
When Mrs. Perry started the presentation, you saw all those different board policies under there. So we're not covering every bit of it.
Okay,
So
but that's still around.
we do. We
Okay.
do have the ability for employees to pay into a day into the catastrophic leave bank. We have a committee that when an employee finds themselves in a situation or where they can apply for catastrophic leave, that approves those, and they have ability to be able to assign those days. So yes, that's covered
the
somewhere else.
bereavement reminded
think
me
of
of
that.
that. That's when a lot of people ended up using that. So okay.
And that's on the the catastrophic leave is on the compensation side
Right,
as well.
right.
So that would be, concurrent with whatever type of leave that person was eligible for.
Okay.
But the catastrophic leave doesn't guarantee their position.
Correct.
Right? Which
Correct.
is why
That
we
helps
would.
with the compensation
Got
once
it.
they've exhausted their leave if they're eligible.
Yeah, you really got to think of it in two ways. Leave
Yeah.
is holding on to the position, and how do we compensate these folks?
Okay, this is a lot of information. Just to make sure that I'm understanding it all, we're still only talking about extending this to certified? No.
This would
This
be
is
for
that
any
list that
full-time
Jeff
employee.
had, any full-time employee. Okay. Okay.
I think now that tell me if I'm wrong, the TDL covers certified or employees that require certification for their position.
Yes.
And we're talking about it, but it doesn't cover those that don't. In essence, we're talking about adding an expansion to cover everyone, not just those that require the certification.
So covering more people and covering for more reasons.
Yes.
I
To
think
make it
that's a
very
that's
simple.
a very concise way to
Yes.
say it.
Very simple.
Yes.
Okay.
Trying to identify gaps that we've actually seen in practice here, so that we can do right by our employees that are doing so much for us in these particular areas.
I think that pretty well says it right there.
It does.
What is it? I guess fundamentally what's driving it is obviously we're seeing some people who are left in the gap that we would like to serve. Is this a common practice across school districts to expand that? Or is this something that we're would be out on our own doing?
So there definitely are districts who have similar policies out there. Historically, we've just really worked on an individual basis with folks to try to best meet their needs and not have to part ways over them needing to be out for an extended period if possible. As we're growing so much as a district, we're finding that it's more and more important that we have very consistent policies and practices in place to ensure that we have equitable treatment of all of our different classes and types of employees.
But to answer your first question, we're not the only people doing this. There are others that do this as well.
But there's no major financial liability. I mean, it's just essentially, we're going to allow you to take time off without pay unless you have other methods of doing that, different forms of leave that you have access to that you've built up.
Correct.
There's not a
There's no compensation component to this.
Okay. I mean, under those circumstances, it seems like a reasonable thing. I mean, I would argue probably most companies don't differentiate between certain kinds of employees and non-certain kinds of employees. I mean, obviously there's a reason why the TDL was written that way, but I mean,
So with the Texas Education Code, we have federal law. It's, a lot of different competing statutes that as we just started working through it, realized that a couple of gaps existed. And so that's why we just want to start the discussion.
What do you need from us tonight?
So tonight, nothing. If you would like to ask us to bring some information back, I've already written down bereavement leave, and so we can bring some more information back for that next time. Or if you would like to just get in touch with me between now and our June meeting, if there's any other information that you would like to see, we plan on bringing back, if we want to continue this conversation, some draft language is what that might look like in these particular areas. So.
it might just be good to have how many employees we're talking about that fit into that are currently not covered under this. And I'm going to guess you don't really have statistics on how many people would have taken advantage of something like this over the last couple of years, given that you don't, normally when you turn people down, you don't write down the reasons for it, kind of stuff, but maybe an estimate. I don't know. That might be an unreasonable request, but it would just be more than anything interesting to see how many people are we really talking about. I mean, are we doing this because we have 3 big instances where, man, we really would have liked to have done this and our current regulations just keep us from doing this, or if this is a pretty common thing, one way or the other.
Okay. See what we can do on that. Maybe have some anecdotal examples as well.
Great, thanks.
Okay. Anything else?
I don't think
And
so.
again, if there's anything else that you'd like to see, just get in contact with me and we'll make sure we can get it. Thank you,
Okay.
Mr. Perry.
Great, thank you. Okay, that takes us to C4, consideration discussion related to a review of policy language in board policy FC local, including the timing of annual enrollment reports and other processes. Dr. Ely, do you have, is it you?
Yeah,
Okay,
yes.
I mean, since,
They're going to put that up there. I'm going to pass around just a copy of FC Local. I think we're going to put that up on the screen to kind of scroll through. I don't do very well scrolling through and talking, so we'll see how well it goes. Y'all remind me when I need to scroll. What we have, the reason this is on the agenda is this has been asked to, did we not have enough?
you got an extra
That's
one?
one. I don't need another one. Just to take some time and review the policy language. I don't know if we want to review everything, but I know that one of the things that came up one of our last couple of boundary adjustments was the timing of the annual enrollment report and when we make decisions, when we can get started, and ultimately make a decision if we need to move attendance boundaries and give that information to families as they have to make changes. So. Mr. Harris asked for this to be put on the board agenda to discuss at a time when we are not considering doing any type of boundary adjustment or any type of changes. We are not opening a school. So I guess let me be clear. We're not planning on doing anything other than just looking at the language and having a discussion at the board level. So at this point, Mr. Harris, I'll just throw it over to you. So what you would like to talk about, and we stand ready to answer any questions or contribute in the discussion in any way that you see fit.
Great. Thanks for that. And in particular for pointing out that it is not associated in any way with any plans to rezone anything. I think we've actually now worked under this twice. And I after going through it, had a few thoughts on it, and I know others have mentioned that they also had a few thoughts, and I thought it would be worthwhile to discuss it, at least while don't have anything on the horizon about rezoning, so we can have kind of an or a discussion that's not viewed through that lens of an active rezoning. And I think maybe before we get started, I'm trying to think when we actually did this and the genesis of it and who all was here. But it kind of came out of a rezoning process in 2016, where I think there was a determination made that didn't go as well in terms of the result it yielded or the process in general that we had hoped for. And it led, I think, to some tough situations that we then had to deal with, particularly crowding at College Station High School. And so the idea was, how do we craft a policy that can help the district as it's dealing with this growth, try to get out ahead of those things so we don't have things kind of jam up on us where we then feel like we don't have the flexibility to do things that we might otherwise want to if we had the time to address those. So that was kind of the history of it and the genesis. And as part of that, we came up with the concept of these annual enrollment reports, where each year the board would be shown the data. What are these school numbers for that year? The timing initially came based on, I think it's our PEAMS report or snapshot date, which is
Yes, sir.
end of
So
October.
every school district in the state of Texas sends in all of their information to the state on the fourth Friday in October. And that's when we clean all that data up, and we've got every kid who's in the school district at that time, and we use that as the primary comparison point year over year. And every school district does that October snapshot date, the last Friday in October.
Okay, so that was kind of the timing. So then we had that, and the idea was that the district would have enough time to take those numbers, get a presentation put together, and then bring it to the board for review in December.
Yes, we send those to our current practice is to send those to our demographer.
To the
Make those-
demographer,
make
right,
those
so that then
projections.
they could get it all turned around and back to us. My impression after dealing with it twice, I thought the elementary rezoning went pretty well in terms of process. I don't know how you all felt about it. Go ahead.
Interrupt you and ask a quick question.
Well, sure.
What is the reason behind that fourth Friday in October? Do you know? For the state
they just had
choosing
to
that
they had to
date?
pick a day,
Is
and
the-
I don't. It's always been that day that I know of. I'm not.
I didn't
I'm
know if
not sure.
maybe people are more settled by then.
Well, I think it does give the opportunity for there's a lot of movement in the first 6 weeks of school, people
Okay.
moving in. And if you are in a high mobility district, you're losing kids, you don't know where they went to, and you've got to find where they went, and you're getting kids and you're getting records, and maybe you're getting them from out of state or out of country. And so it just takes a little bit of time to do that. So that would be my guess is why they did kind of a late fall date.
Yeah, and part of that, that occurs to me, there's nothing really magic about that other than that it is a date, and the numbers are kind of set and given. But if need be, I mean, we could say, okay, well, what are the numbers at the end of September? And we'll go with those to make some projections. So, I mean, to me, that's kind of the point of the discussion. And part of it is, I don't know how much of it is policy and timing, because I can tell you, quite frankly, the thing where I wasn't happy with timing was kind of the pressure on the grandfathering decision on the high school rezoning. It is much harder on rezonings of these campuses that have 4 or more years. I mean, it's elementary and high school. For a 2-year campus, usually by the time we would extend effective date and grandfathering, I mean, those kids really aren't impacted. So it's really these 4-year campuses. I would point out at elementary, we've traditionally grandfathered
The final year,
the final year.
so fourth grade.
So if you're going into 4th grade, you can stay at your campus, but if you would have at least 2 years at your new school. I know there was one time, because of we were opening them so rapidly, there were some kids that would have had to go to 3 or maybe even 4.
Yeah, we did that one time. I can't remember if it was Greens Prairie what we opened, but there was a certain geographic group of students in the district where grandfathering was extended down to 3rd grade as well, because they would have, because of boundary adjustments, they would have had to be on their third elementary school by living in their same house.
Yeah. So that's traditionally what we've done there. Again, that doesn't mean that's how it has to be done in the future. And then for high school, well, we've done it when we opened, we moved. They went 2 years at Consol, and then the people that went to CSHS, well, I've got the man who knows better than anyone sitting right here. Then they moved after spending 2 years at Consol, so it was. It was 1 year. That's right. It was 1 year, and then it was the incoming group. Okay, so we started with 2 grades. Okay, that's right. So we did that, and then in the 2016 rezoning, we grandfathered. Basically, if you had started at that school, you were grandfathered. Is that right? Initially, I think. I'm trying to remember back.
The original recommendation from the committee was to grandfather 10th grade and up. And then after a community forum, the committee went back and changed the recommendation, correct? And, and so we did end up grandfathering the 9th graders.
Okay.
And I'm trying to think of the timing on that. That was, I'm trying to think of the month. That was the fall. That was probably October. I'm looking at you
I
like you know.
apologize.
I don't know.
Honestly, I don't remember.
That's right, October, November.
I think it was because when we had used the committee process, what we typically did, and I've been involved in a lot of boundary adjustments over the years, but we would do committee work in the spring, come to kind of a recommendation, take the summer off so that we didn't foist it upon the community in June or July.
Sure.
Come back in August or early September when everybody's back in school, make a presentation to the board, and the boards typically would at that time would either make a decision in either September or October for implementation the following August, so a little less than a year.
Right. I remember that being how that went that year, because we weren't supposed to talk about it over the summer. That was really hard.
That's right.
Yeah, and so again, we grandfathered all the current students at that
Yes.
spot by grabbing those freshmen.
Right. So, so that to me, now, hopefully that is an incredibly uncommon thing that we had to do in, well, a year ago, so 2018. But I think to me, anything that we could do to get closer to the date that the 2016 one was, which was in the fall, as opposed to mid to late spring, would be better if it did impact particularly high school kids or incoming high school kids. And I don't know if the right answer is, I mean, because you've got this Christmas break right in the middle of that time period. Plus, I mean, the reality is when we now have elections are in November, and you could have a board change as well, kind of in November and December. So that's a consideration as well. So, I mean, to me, the question becomes, you know, how do you deal with that? Hopefully, because of the annual review, you'll see it coming, and you'll kind of know, and you won't have this uh-oh, we have a problem we've got to address sooner rather than later. But, I mean, the reality is we could have that. We could have a sudden influx of students for any number of reasons that would require us to act in very short order. The next, I'm trying to think of a good way to say it. If another group that housed a lot of students no longer housed those students and they showed up at CSISD, I mean, that could be an influx of students on a short term that would be a tough issue potentially for some of our capacity numbers. So to me, I mean, what are y'all's thoughts? And we don't have any action. It's just kind of a discussion, kind of like a lot of our policy things have been tonight. But do we need to look at that? Is getting the snapshot number, getting that turned around from the demographer and then getting it in December, is that the right time frame? To me, it could be. If you look back and you're going to try to do something effective the next year, you would basically, though, I think, have to be dedicated to starting early in January and moving as rapidly as you possibly could through the process to get it done. But, I mean, that's, you better off backing up and doing it in the fall. But, I mean, y'all know, I mean, what November and December look like, and trying to go through that process during those months could be difficult as well. Now, again, ideally, you won't have that short time frame, and you'll be looking more like we were with elementary, where we were a full year in advance, and a lot of times you'll want to be a full 18 months or so in advance of it. That's ideal. But if you're not, what do you do about it? And, one answer could be, sure, leave it like it is. If you see coming on the horizon, hey, we've got an issue we may need to deal with, instead of in December, let's try to get the report in November so we can decide what we're going to do in December and then hit it running in January. Because, I mean, the logistics of the process, finding dates for 7 or 8 people to get together is a difficult thing, as you all will recall. But anyway, those were just my thoughts, and I wanted to give everybody a chance to give feedback and to at least start a discussion about it.
I appreciate you bringing this to the workshop. I think it's a really important discussion. I would definitely like to see us give our families, students, teachers, schools at least a year if we're going to make a boundary adjustment. So does that look like pushing that back, looking at April? And, that would be giving more than a year, but that nothing would go into effect until the full calendar year. And that would take, there could be some situations, but we've also handled some situations with portables, programs, that type of thing. But I think with our district rapidly growing, that, a big concern I think we've all heard from families is the notice, the time to prepare, to establish, whether that be transportation, whether that be, getting their children affiliated with another school. I think that would be an important consideration here.
Yeah, I agree. Now, I want to make sure we're drawing kind of a line between the actual rezoning and then the impact on the grandfathering decision. Because, I mean, the two go hand in hand, and it's when it's impactful. And that's the thing. The further you can get out in front of it and make a decision, to me, the more flexibility you have with grandfathering. Because you can set an effective date. You can be arbitrary, make it next year, but then grandfather everybody who's in 7th grade through 12th or 11th grade. 12th graders will be gone. And you've essentially not made your effective rezoning date till 5 years out.
But FC Local doesn't call out grandfathering, correct? That's subjective to the time, or are there or there are guidelines in here that are very specific to grandfathering. So it doesn't, what I'm saying is like the board policy, if we were to write in when we review the enrollment and make decisions, if there's not a grandfathering clause in place and that they can follow, then, do you see what I'm saying?
Right, there, I mean, it's not set.
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of flexibility.
Right.
And it's, I mean, I would hate to try to tie some future board's hands on grandfathering.
So what we have done in the policy, if you look at the bottom of page 4 of 5, it states what the district has historically done.
Right.
It doesn't say we must, may, or shall. This is kind of how we have handled that in the past. So, and you can see that on page 4 of 5 and 5 of 5.
Yeah, and part of our issue, I mean, a new school, quite frankly, is easier because you have so much lead time, because you don't have a new school until you do all the work to get a bond and then get it passed, and then you have to build the thing. So you have a lot of leadway or lead time going into that, and that's a whole lot easier to plan for. As we get more people and people in the district and population centers shift around, I mean, we all see where new houses are being built with families and kind of know that dynamic. And you see the numbers, and as schools grow and shrink, it becomes a little bit trickier when you're then trying to address, okay, we've got these two, let's pick elementary schools that are over capacity. Well, we have spare capacity somewhere else. So the question is, do we build another elementary school, or do we start trying to use capacity we already have? And well, that's you don't have the same lead time when you're doing that, particularly if the crowding situation at the schools that are overcrowded becomes a problem. And, you know, I definitely agree with you that at least a year lead time is a great standard and a great goal to have. But I can see times that a board might have a circumstance that comes up, particularly right now in the K through 8 realm, where that could be a problem. And they could have a capacity problem, and they might not feel like they actually have a full year to address it. But I mean, they can deal with that too, I guess.
Okay, so I'm just kind of jotting some stuff down, just strictly talking about timeline. And thinking about how we could move some of these. So what's going on in those months? So September, say we did the numbers, and this is just, I'm just talking, thinking out loud.
Sure.
Right? So say we got the numbers in September, but even that, September workshop would be, that's not even the end of September. So we could potentially have only been in school for a month.
3 weeks.
3 weeks, a month at that point. So let's,
We would
not gonna
we
get
would
accurate
have bad
numbers in
data. So
September.
if I might, if you want to take this December day that we're talking about based on snapshot data, and you wanted to move it up earlier in the year to capture the current year's data, probably the quickest we could move it up would be to the November meeting. We would take data from probably third week, maybe fourth week in September, because we've got to do some stuff to clean it up as well before we even give it to the demographers, so they can make the projections, those multiple year projections. And we could get them maybe by the end of late in October at the not regularly scheduled meeting, I'm just guessing, but probably for the regular scheduled meeting in November. That's about as early as we could go.
So,
Oh, no, go ahead.
sorry.
That's if we wanted to do that scenario, kind of move it up earlier.
Yeah, and use current year numbers.
To use current year numbers. There's other things that we could do. If we're not beholden to using the most current numbers, then the calendar opens up and we can consider other times of the year.
But then your data's not as good.
Yeah.
That's not as
Well,
good.
so if we were in this time frame, so it's May, and if we needed to make a zoning decision, if we look at this specific time frame, and we took like the snapshot that you gave us today with the data, we could look at this April snapshot or April or May snapshot and to make a decision not for the 1920 school year, but for the 2021, like really getting ahead of what is this going to look like based on the demographic data so that we can give ample time to make the decisions. If there are portables that need, if there's an emergency situation, I mean, I'll be honest, I lived through Forest Ridge for a couple of years, and Teresa Cott did an amazing job of getting those portables in there, and we were at 900 plus students and didn't skip a beat. I mean, these campuses can handle for a period of time. I think the payoff is proper planning, looking ahead, and giving our families enough time to make these decisions. Understand the decisions, understand the zoning.
And this is a 5-page policy, so there's a lot more into this. And that does include things like adding temporary portable buildings in there for be able to, change programs and move those around. There's other things that are available for short-term fixes that are certainly covered in this policy.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I wouldn't move it to April because you could be losing time. I would rather you get the information at the end of, whether it's November, December. I mean, what you then can do is
I see
say,
what you're
all right, well, we're not going to start it next
whole-
fall. We're going to start it 18 months from
Right.
now.
So us beginning these discussions.
I mean, I'll tell you, that's
in
ideal.
December.
That is absolutely ideal, that you have that much lead time.
So you're
Not-
saying start a discussion in the spring?
No, to start, he's saying in December, but you don't make the decision until the following school year. So we wouldn't make the decision for 1920, we would make it for 2021 if we'd started this discussion in December, if we needed to make a
Well,
change.
right, so,
And just historically, I mean, it sounds silly saying historically because this is 2 years old, but I remember when this was discussed, I think it was Mr. Schaefer who, I'm throwing you under the bus here. No, but it was the idea of, we're going to have these trigger, what was your phrase? Trigger points that would set it in motion. And the hope was at the time, we're going to do this and we're going to rezone. It's what can we do? It's going to set it up to, that's the last resort. And, when this comes up in December, I know everyone's nervous and in the community, what's going to happen? What are they going to do now? Well, the hope is that we don't do anything crazy or rash or, it's like as far as rezoning, but what else can we do? And there are a lot of things listed.
In the meantime.
Right.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, and I think as you mentioned, because of the 2016 rezoning, that I think we could kind of see what was coming right around the bend. The first year this was in effect, the numbers that came back were difficult numbers to work with.
yeah, I think that's right. And that's why it's hard for me to kind of, and what I think we all should focus on is separating that experience from how this plays out moving forward.
Right.
Yes.
Because hopefully that there doesn't have to be a major rezoning at the high school level for quite some time. Because it's incredibly hard on the community. And I know I'm sitting here telling the group that knows that as much as anyone, probably more so. That and the parents and students that are impacted. Because it is a really tough time in life to start addressing those changes. But I think it's a good point, and I think if we, try to back it up, I do like having at least some ability to address the tough situation, because I think I look back, technically our rezoning didn't take effect for 18 months in 2016, but it was the grandfathering piece that is, and that's tough for people. There's no question, and I think we all get that. But as we move forward, I hope we don't have that, and that we can take and maybe get a full grandfathering and implementation if we do it, and maybe try to have the information in November so that then at least in December you could decide what you're going to do. Because just because there's an issue raised at the enrollment, it is important to point out rezoning is kind of the last effort. We would much
and
rather.
building an additional school.
Yep, right. Good point. We're building an additional school and asking for millions and millions of dollars.
Fair enough.
so we can adjust programming, and having more time gives a better chance of being able to implement those things. I mean, we can add portables if we need to go buy more portables. We could do that. Adjusting the programming, staffing, differential staffing, which we've talked about at various points. All those things, to me, you're more likely to get a better result with those, even if you back up that month, because you're not just talking about a month, because you almost get at least 2 months. Because if you get that and kind of decide which direction you're headed, you can at least hit the ground running in January. Whereas if we get the information in December and we don't even really start thinking about what we're going to do with it until January, well, then we have to decide what we're going to do, and then you start planning how you do it. You're starting to eat up your spring, and you're much less able to deal with it. But to me, as long as you could get reliable data in November, and even if they have a special workshop to come get that's worthwhile.
I was
think.
wondering about that.
You bring up a good point, though, about we can set the effective date, right? 18 months out.
Absolutely.
But it's the grandfathering piece that would it be important to call out as well? I mean, again, I understand we wouldn't want to completely handcuff, right? But if we have more of a more predictable grandfathering consideration or written into this policy, that could help the whole planning and adjustment to the community, the families, the students.
Well, I'd point out the differences we saw between 2016 and 2018. And it was the difference of not a couple, 4 or 5 months when a decision was made. In 2016, we didn't hear a peep about grandfathering 8th graders. Right?
Right.
It was 2018 when we were into the spring and we had started dealing with some of the
Transition from middle school to high school
issues,
situations.
that became problematic. And so I think if you recognize that, it's like, okay, well, if that did, and some future group has to decide, well, we've got to move some students. We have some hard choices to make. When do we make it effective? The sooner they do that, I mean, you think about the difference in that period. I mean, now, let's recognize that we're talking about a luxury of not asking kids to do something that we already ask a lot of kids to do, which is change high schools. And a lot of other districts ask kids to change high schools all the time. So we are talking about that. But I do think if we do have to ask that, asking those 8th graders, the sooner in the year you can do it. If you can get back to where we were in 2016 and people say, okay, I got it, we'll plan for this year and we'll go. That's great. 2018, that's not ideal. Somewhere in between is what we're talking about for that particular scenario.
Right.
Ideally, you'd get it long enough out, and you could just set the effective date such that it doesn't impact them, and you don't even have to worry as much about the grandfathering piece. But
Yeah. So specific to high school grandfathering, there are some districts that have put in place, if you start at a high school, you finish at a high school. Now, it doesn't include siblings, but that might not be something bad to consider. As we are growing and we see the need coming down the road sooner rather than later, if our numbers continue to grow, if we have some sporadic influx at this level, I mean, that could be something to consider, again, to be a little bit more predictable. I know I'm starting at this high school. We all know it is a very interesting time in a teenager's life. And that consistency is extremely important, and I'd like to see us address that. I mean, I see your point on the two two-year campuses. You're right. By the time something goes into effect, their essence are not going to be impacted if they haven't gone to that school. But I think at the high school level, I think it's something we should really consider.
I'm not comfortable putting in grandfathering into this, but I think really honing in and figuring out the timing is more important to make sure that we don't set ourselves up for something like that, right? And then also with the timing to consider, make sure that we're not, because you said something about, get the numbers here and then, hurry up and rush. And I don't think that a board should ever be rushed on zoning, on boundary adjustment. So I'd want to make sure we consider that with the new timing, because we need time to discuss things fully and get community feedback. And also, I do think we also need to take into consideration, just throwing more stuff in there to think about, is new board members, potential new board members, when they come on.
Yeah.
And because, I feel like it was crazy going straight into that last year for me. And, Amanda, I know I'm still learning what school board is all about. So I cannot imagine potentially, because sometimes we have 3 board members, that are out there. Years we have 3, and I can't imagine 3 brand new board members coming in and immediately being rushed into a boundary adjustment. So I think that needs to be taken into consideration as well as the timing that the effect has on the students.
Can I offer just a different timing scenario?
Sure.
I don't know that I like it, but I'm just going to throw it out
Probably what
there.
I was about to say, so I'm glad it's you.
June.
Piggybacking off what Mrs. Nolan said about becoming a new board member, having to embark on this in your first, second, third month on the board, if we didn't worry about having the most current data in front of us, if we had a discussion at the board level in April, May, something like that, and say, okay, we think we need to do something, and that something is a boundary adjustment. We're going to start that process. We're going to go to summer. We're going to start that process August as people are starting to come back to school, and start that and go August, September, maybe make a final decision by early October. We will have the benefit of having some additional data come in that we can kind of check our numbers with at that time. But then you're before the elections, you're during an election cycle, but you're before new board members take effect. You don't have the full year in advance, but you have 10 and a half months in advance. And you're doing it for, any new members that have been on the board the previous year, they're starting this in month 9 or 8 or 9 or something like that, not right when they get in there. There's no perfect time to do this. That's just an alternative scenario that.
Right, and let's say you did. Let's pick a year when there's 3, where if you had 3 new board members come in November, and the first thing they get is the enrollment report.
If dates are off, they could not start until December.
They could start December, right? So let's say that happens.
What happened this last year?
Yeah.
Well, right,
Candidates start
Yeah.
till December.
right.
That's
Me
right.
too. I didn't get sworn in
'Cause
until
of
December
canvassing.
either.
So, the board could always say, let's wait to start the rezoning process, if that's the decision, in April or May, or a full till August. But I still go back to, I like the idea of having the information sooner, because that frees up your flexibility to do the programming, all the non-rezoning options, because you still have the flexibility to push it back.
What Ms. Nolan said, just as far as, you don't want to rush this, and And I agree. As she was saying that, I kind of went where you went, Dr. Ely, as far as, we could get this information in November or December, but we don't have to, I think we got it in December, didn't we? And then we came back and kind of took action in January and said, this is what we're going to do.
We talked about it in January, and then I think we decided what we were going to do in February, if memory serves me correctly.
And then all of a sudden, we're in this mad dash to get it, not a mad dash, but, time was of the essence at that time. If we took our time and then we came back with your timetable, again, now people don't have as much time before it goes into effect. We voted in April. It technically goes into effect, in August, which was 16, 17 months later. But if we came back or even worked at it over the summer a little, I mean, who knows? But if it was done in September or October, again, they're going to have their 10 months. You would have kids who've started, and I don't want to bog it down with grandfathering, but you've got kids who've started high school, but the 8th graders haven't gone through
All the spring stuff?
exactly the stuff that starts in January, February. When is
March.
that? Or March?
Well, no, I think they start turning in schedules in January.
Yeah.
And that can't be backed up, correct? I mean, that can't be pushed
No.
back.
Yeah, and I think that's the hope is that as long as you're looking at it annually and you're getting good information and seeing it, you can see what's coming, and they do have that luxury. I mean, I'm open to timing, but I'll tell you, I think getting good information as soon as you can get it, you have the snapshot date. If we have the information, let's get it to people so they have more time as opposed to less time. Because you can always defer and be deliberate in your pacing. I mean, quite frankly, like we were with the elementary, we chose to wait for a very good reason. We normally would have done it
In the spring.
in the spring, but we chose to wait until the fall so that we could see the actual impact of the charter school, so we would have better data on which to base the rezonings. And I mean, so we had the flexibility and were able to defer from a timing standpoint, and I thought that went fine. In terms of kind of some of the feelings, I think I didn't feel rushed. I mean, I felt like we could go out and walk on trails and do things like that, right? But I mean, again, I think it's, one, I think you can. I think the only really thing, I mean, from a policy standpoint, unless you're wanting to start prescribing things, which I'll tell you, I think that's a bad idea, just because you don't know what the future holds. And if you start having to look at your policy and go, oh, this is a very bad result, we don't like that. That's why that flexibility is good. And the whole key is to back up your timing so you have that flexibility, and then you can do things like you want to do, which is defer the time and give as broad of grandfathering as you possibly can. I mean, I don't think there's anybody here that would say we don't want to do that when we can. At least I wouldn't, because to me, the more time you give people to plan and adjust, the better. And the more flexibility you have to expand your grandfathering, the better. But those two things both, I mean, they have other forces pushing against them. And one is, do you ever get the thing implemented, the rezoning, to actually see the impact? And then
I think that's where we have an opportunity to be proactive, right? So as we look at, we can kind of, like you said, we can see around the corner, so to speak, and being very intentional. Because I'm just playing the other side of it, right? So if we leave it subjective to future boards, right? That leaves, as far as when we talk about grandfathering, we leave that's the unpredictability, that's the insecurity of what, our community is feeling, like from a high school boundary perspective. If we if we have something, for example, you start at whatever school you start with, you can finish at, then so when we think about if we were to enact something like that this year, and we think about the future, those are the types of numbers we would pull and understand and use in our decision-making process for future alignment, future programs, future whatever we need to do to adjust that before we go to the zoning. I think not spelling it out, like I said, puts it in future boards' hands, and it can be extremely subjective.
And I get that point. I'd also point out, well, that same future board could just change the policy.
I think that would be much more difficult, though. I mean,
It's not set in stone. No, I hear what you're saying, and I think it is important to point out that I think future boards would also know those same issues and would weigh the difficulty of what they're asking people to do, and would make those decisions just like this board or past boards. And I don't know that you need that level of specificity in your policy. But I mean, if that's what folks want to do, we certainly can. But I think the question that really I would like to explore is timing and thoughts on if anybody sees the change they want to make on timing. I still think once you have the numbers, get it out. There's no reason to wait until the spring, because if you've eaten up more valuable time that you could use to do things, to buy flexibility for grandfathering, to buy flexibility for alternatives to rezoning, and making use of that time is important. And if we can do it and get the information early, figure out if there is an issue, you can start on it. Even if they're new board members, if there's an issue, well, those new board members are going to have to learn quick, because you've got to start dealing with those hard issues just like you did right up front. And I can tell you, a couple of months learning curve versus a couple of months of time and flexibility. I would much rather have the time and flexibility as a new board member than what I would have learned in a couple of months. I just think you're much more likely to be able to do the things you want to do in terms of the needs you have and the flexibility you feel like you do have. Time is always on your side there, so the more you can get, the better. That's my take on it after having gone through a couple of these.
I've just looked through this one more time, and the only thing that is time, that addresses time on here is the word December. That we have this annual report. So we could change that to November. We could change that to the fall. We could change it. We could take time out of it. I would say that we should probably, for flexibility's sake, avoid saying we will start any boundary adjustment process and name a month or have a decision by a month, because there's just too many variables that we
just
cannot
like with
foresee.
the elementary, right?
Yeah, we can't even foresee at this point. So.
Well, so I guess, I mean, a simple fix would say November and or December, or November or December. That's one idea. And again, we're not taking any action tonight. But, I'm just telling you my idea. I'm looking for feedback and thoughts, and because you have the data.
Would you mind going back to your scenario?
About
The timing.
timing? See if I can do it again. So my idea was to have a full-on discussion in the spring semester, but we could get that information in the November, December timeframe and have that at that time. But what I was thinking was in the April or so time frame that we go through this, going through the data right there, based on the information that we had from the fall and say, okay, if the ultimate decision is we need to go with some sort of a boundary adjustment, that we would start that work August. As people start thinking, it still is summer, but you know, especially if it's high school, it's not really summer anymore because everything started. Cross country, band, football, you know, theater, all that stuff is starting. And then you work August, September, and make a decision by the end of September, early October for implementation the next August.
Which is historically, again, I know,
No, if you go back to the ones that we did in the 2000s and early teens, that's kind of what we did. The ultimate decision was made in September or October.
I mean,
I like that because it almost gives a
that's a
summary of the year.
rezoning process, right?
That's a rezoning process, yes.
Right, which the point I'm making is you clearly could decide to do that. Getting the information as soon as you have it. I mean, what are you going to base the April report on? April numbers are our snapshot date.
It's still the snapshot.
Right.
Yeah.
So we can get the information. And then, I mean, absolutely, if you do have to go through a rezoning, you have that option if that's when you want to do it. Well, and hopefully you wouldn't have, oh my gosh, we have this need when we have to act sooner rather than later. I mean, who knows what the future is going to be, but that's what I'm saying is you've given up time if you wait to get the numbers months and months and months. And I can tell you, I mean, you all felt it. I mean, somebody used the word rushed. I mean, if I could have had and known what I knew and would been able to be done January 20, life might have been a little different for a lot of people in the community. And since it's based on information that's available at the end of October, I'd rather get the information out as soon as you possibly can. That's my take. You can always delay when you do a rezoning process or when you talk in further detail. But I mean, if you can push up when you get the information, I don't see what you lose, as long as you can get good, reliable.
So can I push on that a little bit then?
Sure, absolutely.
So you're talking about maybe a report in November. And then November is maybe the first month for the new board members if we have board turnover, or it may be in December. But we get that information early. The board can deliberate on that in December, early January. Decision is made to do some of these other alternative, scenarios, like capping enrollment or differential staffing or moving programs or purchasing. We have plenty of time in our budgeting process to work through that through the spring. But if another facility utilization option like a boundary adjustment comes up, could direct the administration, let's start this process not this spring, but we're going to wait until August, and we're going to do it August, September, and do it in that time frame.
Absolutely.
Or we could do it in the spring, whatever it is that
Whatever works best. I mean,
at that time.
you think that's what we did with elementary? We said, well, let's wait till the full following fall so we can at least see some preliminary impact of the charter school.
Yes, sir.
So, I mean, that's in essence what we did. Anyway, that's.
So,
But even in that circumstance, all that did was that doing that, even though I believe firmly that was the right decision because we had actual accurate data at that point. And the reality is we cut short the amount of time and notice that we gave people in terms of when they were going to do that. I mean, the logical time to do a rezoning, other than the fact that doing anything in the fall is a giant pain for about 1 billion different reasons, is to do it in the spring to become effective the following, not the next school year, but the
August after that.
right, the August after that. I guess I would agree with Mr. Harris in that the logical time to get this data is as soon as feasible to get accurate information. I mean, that's just really what it boils down to. Any board at any point can say, we're not going to rezone until May, or we're not going to rezone until for good reasons, we're going to wait till September or whatever. But, I mean, pushing it off does us no good. And I think you'd want to give every board the opportunity to have access to accurate information as soon as possible. And that might mean, obviously, new board members coming in December, and the hope is that they would actually see what happened in November at that point. But, I mean, I agree. I think we all agree that the last rezoning sucked in terms of when it happened, and
I would say the
I
one,
would-
one before last.
The last high school one is what
yeah,
you're
it's the
talking
last
about.
high school one. I mean, I think the elementary was fine. But I do think, I am very wary about putting in a defined grandfathering clause in our policy. Because even if we did something that essentially said, once you start a high school, you'll always be able to finish, I can think of about 4 different reasons why we might not want that to that won't be true when we build a 3rd high school. We can't make that happen. It's just not the way it will work. B, if we have, I'm not in any way saying this is going to happen, if we have a charter school that all of a sudden can't meet its financial obligations and craters, and we end up with a giant influx of students, then I'm not sure we can promise it under that circumstance either. So to me,
But I hear what you're saying, but I think it then becomes a data point, right? So if we know
yep,
how many that would affect, that would be part of the consideration. So does that make sense? So if
Yep.
you have that date, all of the data, if you know, okay, who started here, could finish here, that would be a part of the data points you would use in making that decision if
yeah.
you were
But
having to rezone.
I guess I would also say, you know, outside of when we built College Station High School and started, there has never been a point where we haven't said basically, once you start a high school, you get to finish a high school. Even under this last circumstance, when we chose not to grandfather 8th graders, those 8th graders hadn't started high school at that point. I mean, we gave them the option to continue and start, and
Well, but they had enrolled. They'd enrolled and tried out and,
no,
Yeah.
I completely get it.
Right.
I mean, I think we all agree that sucked. I mean, but technically they hadn't started. So unless you're going to create a grandfathering policy that says, well, we're never going to rezone a kid from high school once they pass the fall semester of their 8th grade year. I mean,
and we could. I mean, that could be part of the predictability.
you could. I just don't. I mean, I don't know. Having sat on 2 of these rezoning committees and then been on the board for, I don't even know, 3 or 4 others, counting elementaries. Every single one of these brings up incredibly unique situations that these things are done for different reasons and at different times and at different moments for all kinds of different stuff. And while in theory I agree with you that I would love for that not to happen, I just think that it's unrealistic to hamstring future boards with you can and can't do this as you move forward. You know,
guess maybe
which is
we-
why I think this policy is as broad as it is right now. And I agree, we want to give people as much notice and present as little risk is not the right word I'm looking for. As much certainty as we can give them going into this.
I think we have the opportunity to give our community a lot of certainty and really take into consideration and you know, I'd love us to explore this, right? So what does that look like? Other districts have done this. They have an assurance and that their child who has gotten involved in a certain program or whatever is going to be able to fulfill that. And again, it becomes, we will have the data to show that helps us to be able to predict future boundary adjustments, programs, whatever's needed to accommodate. But it gives our community a bit of an assurance and that there's not an unpredictability factor of what a future board could determine and decide to follow in FC local and what another board decides not to follow in FC local.
I get it. I mean, I'll be glad to pass a whole bunch of different policies that will tell the board what they have to do over the next 5 years, and I'm not going to be here for it. And we hamstring people with situations and possibilities that we can't foresee at the moment. And I completely get it. I mean, I think if you've watched our struggle with grandfathering and rezoning, and every single one of these times we've been through this.
But if we look at hamstringing, I mean, there is some stake in the ground here as far as trigger points with demographic data. Like, we have put in the considerations, and maybe we need to look at changing the primary considerations or looking at that. What are we trying to accomplish?
So, could Mr. Harris, if I might jump in, it seems like we need some more conversation on this. We don't have any action on this, and I would point to the fact that we're at 6:45 and we have a
they've
board
gotta
meeting
redo
that
the
starts
room.
at 7, and we need to adjust the room. So what we can do with item C5 is that is on the agenda for consideration at the board meeting tonight. It's a consent agenda item that we can pull off consent, so we can talk about it at that time if that pleases the board.
I think that's a good idea. Sorry, Chuck. So then I guess we should just adjourn and then we'll come back at 7?
Yeah, we can come back at 7 for the regular board meeting.
Okay, sounds
Okay.
good. And then we can pick this up later.
Could we put this on the next board workshop to continue the conversation?
Yes, assuming we have time. Okay. Everyone else, we're good? Okay, then we're adjourned until 7.